Welcome everyone to the first of 3 talks to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Alcuin Society. I should explain Alcuin because most people want to know what it means. Alcuin was actually an 8th century monk in York in Britain who had a fabulous library which he took off to Europe and became Emperor Charlemagne's mentor. Emperor Charlemagne actually being illiterate originally. So that was Alcuin, and then he ended up as the Bishop of Tours in France. To learn more about the society, go to our website, which is a very good one, and we're very proud of it. And it has fascinating blogs on it. And please consider joining us. I should give thanks to David Cooperstone, who will be handling the video. And that was made possible by Dr. Joseph Wosk, who is good to us. He, incidentally, is in London, England at the moment, involved with a celebration of Canadian artists at the Canadian consulate. So you can't stop Joseph. So I think that's the preliminary stuff. Please go to the website. Thank you all for coming on a miserable evening. And now I'll hand over to Brian Marr, who will introduce Alex Remmer.
Well, I'm glad to be up here to introduce Alex. And for people that don't know who I am, I'm Ryan Marr, and I'm a graphic designer and a filmmaker. And I was fortunate enough to spend a good about 4 years with Jim near the latter parts of his life, and I would spend every Sunday with him. We would converse, and he would basically, I apprenticed under him, learned and got into the printing, got interested in printing. And during my quest to learn more about him and ultimately make a documentary about him, wanted to know a lot about his personal life and the things that that kind of drove him to do what he did. And Jim was a very private man, as we all know. And so I'm really happy to introduce Alex, who's going to kind of show us perspective. Sorry, over here. I'm like, oh, I thought he was over there. Alex here, who's going to give us a perspective that I don't think a lot of us have seen. We know Jim as the type designer, Jim the illustrator, the typecaster, the book binder, it goes on, the mechanic, the jack of all trades. But I think it's going to be great to see the perspective of Jim the grandfather from Alex's perspective. So there's that. And another interesting thing that you'll see today is a chunk of these slides come from Jim's shop. There was a little box of slides, maybe 24 slides that I don't think a lot of people have seen. And a lot of these slides are probably from the late 80s, early 90s, which finding images of Jim back in the day is very difficult. So it's a treat to share that with everyone, and I think it's going to go well with Alex's talk. So without further ado, Alex Remmer.
Alrighty, well, thank you for coming, everyone, and let's go through it. I figure, try to make things easy and open with a joke. In the beginning, there was nothing, and Jim said, "Let there be type," and it was good. Well, my grandfather was born to an immigrant family in the, how did I not write that down? 1930 something? 34, there we go. I made notes for this kind of thing. And he always started off as the adventurous one. He often described himself as a little kid as being the real-life Tom Sawyer. Always off getting into trouble, getting into adventures, him and his friends and their pocket knives, carving up everything they could. I even remember him telling a wild story of building a boat and taking it down to the river against his mom's wishes. School never went well for him early on because of that, because he never had time to really pay attention to what the teacher was talking about, too busy drawing in the margins and just taking off from there. Which helped him a bit later on in life when he did start high school and was working with, that's where he got his introduction to type. He would see the galleys and start collating the stuff out. So he already started to get a feel for it. And with that as well, it was also greatly at the urging of his grandfather, who after grade 10 his grandfather said, why don't you come work for me for the summer? Work for us at J.W. Boyd and Sons. You'll be a courier. It'll be great. So Grandpa joined for that at the prospect of the big bucks of it. And at the end of it, he was considering going back to school, but his grandfather really urged him, you know what, it's time to take a trade. And I'm actually going to quote from my grandfather's autobiography here. When he went down to his grandfather's shop on Duke Street, his grandfather said, so I hear you want to go back to school. That's a fine thing to have an education. We have a fine opportunity to have a trade. Printing is an old and respected craft. There's art in printing. You're artistic. You'll have a chance to use it. At what time, printers are the only people, aside from nobility, who are allowed to carry swords. And he took a pause. And he continued, and if you don't take the job, I'll kick your little arse all the way up Duke Street. Well, at the end of that summer, my grandfather did take the job just down on Hastings Street, right across from where the old Woodward's building used to be, at J.W. Boyd and Sons, Printers and Publishers. Started a 6-year apprenticeship under a foreman by the name of Ozzie. Bit of a grumpy old man, but the man knew his work and really taught Grandpa well. After Ozzie left, my grandfather met a man named Larry Day, who took over the shop. And that's really where my grandfather got the true love of the art. As Larry was always talking and taking appreciation in the work in front of him, and my grandpa really started to hang on to that as well. The one thing that he always loved with the printing was feeling the way the letters and the ink would sink into the paper. And that's one thing that Larry helped instill on him as well. Well, during that period, he also reacquainted himself with Alberta, my grandmother, whom they had known since elementary school. Hey, I was there, I remember that. And they reacquainted and ended up getting married in 1955, and they were together for the rest of his life. And after they were married, they had 3 children. Julie, born in '56, who unfortunately didn't survive past her 15th birthday due to encephalitis. And in '59, my father was born. Shortly thereafter, my grandfather's apprenticeship was done, and it was time to look for honest work. I think my drawings are up here. And he found it up in Williams Lake, at the Williams Lake Tribune, where he went up there and immediately began work, again, for the paper, doing everything he could. And they were grotesquely short on the actual type they needed to do the work and put the pages together, always cannibalizing something that was just printed half an hour earlier. So my grandfather's urging, they bought themselves a monotype caster, and they brought it up, and he fixed it, repaired it, got it running, and got the Tribune really functioning up to the level they needed to. It's also while he was up there, a few other major things happened. My Uncle Tom was born while up there, and he also decided to pick up the cornet and start learning some jazz. And as he described it, he's amazed he didn't drive Granny insane. Well, if we've all met my Granny, we know he did. And it was during this jazz era when he decided to come back down to Vancouver to catch a Louis Armstrong concert, and he looked around and realized, what am I doing in Williams Lake? I've got Vancouver right here. So in short order, he packed the family, and they all came back down south. From there, it was a few jobs moving around from print shop to print shop, just trying to find the good work and keep food on the table. Various places from The Optimist. He was taking night classes at Vancouver School of Art, where he was also learning more just ways to apply his craft and finish putting it together. He worked at The Citizen, and eventually he worked at Creative House, where he was doing a lot of their design work and templating, getting everything together. And it was at that one when he was sent off by his boss to deliver some of the work he had just done. And he found out how much he was being billed at when, innocently enough, he saw the invoice that Creative House was handing to this other company, and he saw, well, that's 5 times what I'm making. I think it's time to be my own boss. So the world of freelance appeared, and he worked for a while, doing both jobs on freelance and with Creative House. Of course, the bosses found out and tried to talk him out of it, but nothing doing, and the world of freelance awaited. So he got himself a little shop down at 1182 East Hastings, just down the street. Drove past it on the way here tonight, actually. And for there, he worked for probably the next dozen years, just taking any of the art jobs he could. And amazingly enough, one of his first and best customers was Creative House, the guys he just left. Shows you the work. During his time as a freelancer, technology really started to change. When he got into it, the print and the hot lead was still the industry that there was. But this little thing called the computer was really starting to show up and take over and push print and printing and typography in new directions. Well, early on in the 80s, he met up with someone who was trying to pioneer in the work by the name of Gerald Giampa, and they got together with Gerald's company called Giampa Textware, and they started working on digitizing fonts. Giampa himself got some equipment, got some training in Germany on a little program called Icarus. And that's one thing that my grandpa always hung on to because he found some use in it. Giampa Textware didn't really last very long. Grandpa was with them for about 4 years before they packed up shop and it disappeared from there. But he kept the old Mac and he kept Icarus because he found he could really convert that to his other uses. He tried his hands and, oh dear God, that's me. Don't look at that, no one saw that. Thank you. Later on in his career, my grandfather decided, he was really going to try his hands at digital fonts and selling them on his own, taking fonts of his own design and digitizing them, but really wasn't quite going according to plan early on. But then later in his life, he ran across a company named the P22 Type Foundry, who actually bought a great amount of his digital fonts. Gave him a happy little nest egg and led to retirement and more printing from there. During this time, he was also teaching everywhere and started his book binding and basically anything you could do with art. If there was art involved, he was there for it. Shortly after his retirement, probably about 5 minutes after he decided to retire, he was back down on the print shop and finally decided to continue his lifelong dream of printing Tom Sawyer, which is a book he'd tried early on in the 80s, but realized that is just entirely too ambitious a project. I don't have the time, I don't have the resources, but with retirement, he got nothing but time. So his dream project finally came to fruition, and he finished Sawyer. I'm sure many of you have seen Cobb. I love that window. His work covered many different aspects, and he would always be moving technology to try to get it towards his own needs. Things he would learn from his study of the work of Gaudi or from his good friend Dunsing as well. And the one that always blew my mind when I was a little kid was this thing called electroplating. Because I remember as 6 years old, I'd run down to the basement, this giant dark place with all this insane machinery. It looked like you could launch a space shuttle from there. And behind the furnace, there was this little container filled with blue liquid, and there were wires going in and out of it, and there was crystals everywhere. And it was the coolest looking thing ever. I said, "Hey, Grandpa, what is that?" He said, "It's electroplating." Cool. No idea what that is. Only that I would find out later he was using it to make copies of existing cut fonts so that he could then put it in his own monotype caster and then create new fonts to use on his own. It was a method that he later abandoned in terms and moved on to his pantographs instead, which is a machine where you could draw out a large letter about this big and trace it on this machine that would then cut it about this big down on the other side, and he would then put those into his caster as well. But the electroplating always blew my mind, seeing this little piece of science fiction hiding behind the furnace. I don't know how he didn't blow the house up with that thing. I don't know how he didn't blow the house up with a lot of things, come to think of it. But the thing I remember with his work is no matter what was going on, he'd always be sketching. There was always a pencil in hand. I'd come over in the evening to see how they're doing. God, feed cats. And he'd be sitting on the couch just drawing letters all the time. And many of those eventually got digitized through the program called Icarus, which was then put on his pantographs. For anyone who hasn't seen it, there's actually an excellent documentary called Making Faces that I'd highly recommend you guys look into. I don't want to bore you all with the technical aspect here, so let's not go from there. But other than that, it was building everything. He'd buy a machine that didn't work, and he would basically beat it with a hammer until it worked, build his own parts of whatever he could, strip the machine down, just remember how it was put together, and rebuild it and get everything going from there. Nothing would ever stop him. He'd buy a machine that hadn't run in 20 years. It'd take him another 20 to get it working again, but eventually it happened. So, during the course of his work, he did manage to get several of his fonts actually cast into lead following the original teachings of Gaudi's work and the methods that he had developed. Many named after family, many named after friends. Some of his more popular ones was the font of Alberton, or Julian Old Style, or Stern, or Hannibal Old Style, named after the birthplace of Mark Twain, which is a font that was, to this point, only ever used in his printing of Tom Sawyer. I actually have an example of it up here if anyone wants to come up and have a look at it at the end of the show. The main thing I always remember about his print shop is the way it's slowly built. Like all of his art, that house was constantly growing and in a state of flux. As a little kid, I remember when his big old print shop out back was finally built. I was really excited because he had put a little concrete step leading up there, and I spent all day waiting for it to dry enough so I could grab a nail and write my name into it. There was a photo of that up there somewhere. It might have already passed. But you'd look around at these absolutely amazing machines, and through the eyes of a child, you have no idea how big that place looked. And the absolute mad scientist little world you could just disappear into in these corners of a basement that had no end. And just the amazing machinery down there. And all the time, standing in the corner was my smiling grandfather, beard, chisel in one hand, coffee in the other. There was coffee everywhere. The nonstop array of coffee cups. I think there was more coffee than there was hot lead down in that basement. But it kept him going. And for many years, as others have mentioned before, there was always this old Jag that was down there as well. Big red old beast, early 60s, Jag Mark II. What a glorious machine. Smelled of old leather. Gotta love it. Everyone saw it. Always wished they could see it running. But I remember those few days when it did, and I'd get my rides to school in it. Pull up feeling like the king. All the other kids would watch me get out of the car, and they'd watch it drive off, and they'd all have their eyes wide open, seeing this amazing old machine drive by. It was a truly wonderful machine. And too bad it was more dreams than metal by that point. But God, he loved that car. I always wished I could have got him a new one, but could never quite find one. So I had to buy him a little model instead. He had that for many years. It was also actually with him down that print shop I had my first job. It was one of my days off school. I was getting all excited to just romp around in the backyard and generally cause a ruckus all day. And my grandpa said, "Nope, I need you to come give me a hand. I'll pay you $20 for the day." What? $20? This was my allowance was $2. This was unheard of. So I went down and I helped him with a printing job, and he was running it off of his hand presses, and I was interleafing it away to make sure everything didn't smudge. And we spent the afternoon down there just surrounded by the smell of ink, the smell of machine oil as they were running, and a fresh paper as we got everything together and hopped in his old van and took it down for delivery. And it was truly amazing to actually see the equipment running the way it was meant to be, and not just me sitting there pulling levers and making noise and running away before I got yelled at for it. The other thing you were always finding in that house was the cats. They were everywhere. Many of them have actually been pictured here already. And it's funny because the jokes are always been made about my grandmother being the crazy old cat lady, but that's really not the case. It was always my grandpa. A new cat would walk in the back door, because it was always open, and my grandpa would look at it, no more cats in the house. I'm not bringing in another cat. Of course, the cat had other plans. All it had to do was sit on my grandpa's lap for about 30 seconds, and it was a new member of the family. Every time, without fail. I remember myself and my father one night when we bought them one of their more recent cats, a cute little Siamese kitten, which we eventually named Neko. We brought it down for them, and my grandpa's like, "Oh, you guys got yourselves a new cat." And he said, "No, we got you a new cat." He's like, no more cats for me. I'm not having any of this. I'm not. Oh, hey, a new cat. And it was sold. Took all of 10 seconds. But he used to love to sit outside in that little bench that we saw photographed earlier, which we nicknamed the Art Gallery, after his favorite old cat named Arthur, who was always sitting out there with him. I remember one of my earlier times, after I'd helped Grandpa with the leafing job, I figured I was going to help him with another job, because I was down there. My dad was off at a gig that night, and Grandpa was sitting there really stressing out because he had this project he needed to work on. He needed to write some stories. I said, "Well, Grandpa, what do you need to write?" He's like, "Well, I've got to do these things about animals or something. I need to write a story about a crow, and I just can't write a story about a crow." So Smart-ass 10-year-old me went down and grabbed my pen and sat in the corner and decided I was going to write my grandpa's story about a crow. So I wrote him a little story about a crow that wouldn't shut up, and how it was annoying everyone in the neighborhood, so this guy got his cat to come chase off this crow, and it got all its friends and chased him off and his cat. So there's dozens of crows that won't shut up. And I had a good laugh, and I handed it to him, and he had a big belly laugh. Kept it in his bookshelf for the rest of his life after that. I always remember seeing it sitting there, so that was fun. It never did see print. I was always hoping to see that one in the big books, but my first foray into publishing didn't quite go according to plan. But there was other times he was always up for a fracas. You could always see, even later in life, the little twinkle of mischief that would appear in his eye. It was one day my friends and I were out in the backyard having a water fight. Us and our super soakers, my cousin was with us. And my grandpa walks out into the yard and sees us going, and he gets a little hop and stuff. Hey, can I join the fight? And I said, well, you don't have a water gun. He's like, oh, I've got my water gun. Can I join? We said, sure. He's like, okay. And with a big hop in his step, he runs over and he grabs the garden hose and just starts blasting the lot of us. And we're screaming, not fair enough. I was like, well, you said I could use my gun. Big old smile on his face, soaking us as much as we could. So I quickly ran in the back of the house and grabbed a bucket, filled it up, and went up to the window just above the hose and dumped it out. It was right there. I dumped it out of that window. And I think he drove off by the time that picture was taken. But always up for an adventure, always up for the art. His art was the one thing that I always remembered more than anything, and I always loved seeing the different pieces. And I tried to build myself a modest collection of his work. And one thing I decided very early on, actually, is, well, it's time for me to get a tattoo. I need to get some work, and you know what? I'm going to do a tribute to Grandpa on this one. So I decided early on, of course I didn't tell him my plan. I said, hey Grandpa, so I see you got some of these prints hiding up in your shop. You got a whole stack of them. You mind if I take one? Not telling him, of course, why I'm doing it. Yeah, absolutely, go right ahead. So I went up and I grabbed one and shoved it in my pocket and scampered off. Continued with my nefarious little plan. Well, I was always a little too nervous to try to actually get it done because I don't want to get poked with a needle. I mean, yeah, I'd love to have the art, but needles. Well, eventually Grandpa did get sick, and it was nearing the end, so I got the hammer down and I got the work done. And I took this piece to an artist up in Vancouver who beautifully put it on my shoulder, and I got to take it to Grandpa and he got to see it. And absolutely we will. I need to change out of this thing because I don't want to have to go Hulk Hogan on us. But I took it down to him and I showed it to him. And he couldn't talk at that point, but he grabbed my arm and yanked me forward and was carefully looking at it with a big grin on his face and gave me a big thumbs up. And it was the last time I ever saw him smile. And it's a piece I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my life very happily. But enough of the sad notes. The one thing we've all been talking about here is the art and the building, the nonstop renovations. Oh, the renovations. That house never stopped renovation. As soon as he would start one project, he's like, I'm going to do this amazing thing and it's going to be great. And he'd get about 80% of the way through it. And then run out of funding, or Granny would come home from her weekend off and he had to stop and he'd hide and do something else. But then the next season he would start another project. So the whole house was an absolute Frankenstein's monster of projects always growing. But beyond that, his one true love, above all else, was his ice cream. My God, did that man love his ice cream. I asked him once what his favorite flavor was. He asked what I meant. I said, what's your favorite flavor of ice cream? He's like, the kind that's got ice and cream in it. I'm like, okay, well, that seems to make some sense to me. And there was one time I was 12 years old, and I was rooting through their fridge, and I saw there was a big old bucket of ice cream in the back. And Grandpa was sitting on the couch, patting the cat and just watching some TV. And I said, hey, Grandpa, can I have some ice cream? And he said, yeah, help yourself. Magic words to a 12-year-old. So I went in there and I took the ice cream and I took a bowl and I scooped out, well, let's be honest, entirely too much ice cream because I was 12 years old. I put the bucket back in and I started to walk away. As I'm walking back, there's Grandpa and he's looking at me, he's like, what do you think you're doing? And I said, well, you said I could have some ice cream. He's like, yeah. I said you could have some. What do you call that? Come with me. And he marched me right back into the kitchen. I was so busted. And he goes and he grabs the container, and I know he's going to scoop half of it back. And he looks at me and he looks over at my grandmother's kitchen utensils and grabs the biggest spoon he can find. This one right here. And he dug into the ice cream so hard he bent it backwards. And then he bent it back forwards and put this happy little kink right in the middle. And then he stopped and he looked at me, the horrid look on his face. He's like, I won't tell Granny if you don't. I said, it's a deal. So he put it back in the tray and grabbed a different spoon and served me out probably twice as much ice cream as I took in the first place. I was like, that's how you eat ice cream. Get it right next time. And then we left from there. But those are always the main things I remember, is the ice cream, the shop, the building, the helping, the old car. And always the smile on his face, and always seeing new people when he'd walk down into that little shop. So I thought I wrote down more, but apparently I didn't. That's what I've been doing for the last 10 minutes. Well, at this point, I guess I need to thank everyone for your time, and I really wish I had written more now. This whole winglet thing didn't quite go according to plan, but I guess I can open to questions if anyone wants to ask about the ask what I know about my grandfather. I'll be sure to make up only half the answers.
Can you hold up the spoon again?
Which one?
The spoon.
The spoon.
Wonderful. You model it perfectly.
Well, I love it because my grandmother, being the amazing Olympic level pack rat that she is, I managed to get this spoon when she moved out of her house on 11th, like 20 years after the thing got bent. But hey, it's great. So. It is still used for ice cream, in case anyone's actually wondering.
Yes.
Did he make art prints like maybe the ones you got in that?
Basically, everything you see on here actually is art that he had done for his books. Most of them done on either woodblock or lino cuts, and then run through his old hand-fed presses. So several of these. This was from a calendar. This, like the one I held up, is a title page from a book he'd done called Allison's Fishing Birds. I believe the Canada Goose was from a book called Shadow River, which was a poetry book that he had published. And ones farther down, the ones at the end is all from his printing of A Christmas Carol that he had done back in, I believe, the late 90s. So this was all of his artwork as well. I mean, as well as just being the font designer and doing that kind of thing, it was, when you started producing books, well, you need art to go with it, because you can't just look at words on a page all day. So everything was illustrated with his lino cuts and doing the full color prints as well.
Alex, tell him about climbing the plum tree.
So when I was a little kid, I thought I was really hot stuff at climbing all the trees in the yard, and I thought I was so fast I could climb way up. And it was one day, this big plum tree up front, and I climbed up to my favorite little corner and said, "Hey, Grandpa, look how high I can go. Bet you can't do this." Well, that was the wrong thing to say, apparently. Like a squirrel with a beard and a sweater, he shot up that tree about 5 feet higher than I did. And in 4 huge hops at the other end of the tree. And then he just swung down and looked like, "Haha, that's what you get for challenging me in my tree." Stomps off all happily. So. I didn't know he had that kind of agility, and then later I found out, oh, so he did acrobatics when he was young. That explains a few things. But you can never upstage him. You try to do silly, you try to take too much ice cream, he takes more. You try to tell a silly joke, he would tell another one. You try to climb a tree and he'll out-climb it. So I don't think I ever climbed that tree the same way again. I tried. I got about halfway as high as he did. I'm like, I don't know how he did this. I'm going to climb down now before I fall. But. Yes?
Alex, were you around when Rich Kegler from P-22 came down and they started filming with your grandpa? Because that went on for a little while, right? Was it done like
I wasn't
in segments? Do you know a little bit about that?
It was done basically all in one huge whack.
Was it?
Kegler came up for, I think it was a span of about a week to try to get it filmed because he knew that the font was being produced. And he showed up and basically camped out on the couch and went downstairs and with the camera work and started filming while the work was being done. So it was, from what I understand, the filming itself was done over a very short period of time. And but then there was other photos that would be taken over the course of a few weeks that were then added in to...
Because there's lots of extras on the DVD of like just minutia of
Yeah, no, absolutely.
totally geek stuff, like, you know, the sharpening of the tools and
Yep, all of that was done pretty much within about a 1 week stretch.
that must have been a pretty intensive.
Well, it actually wasn't that intense because basically Claypool would just stand back with a camera and just watch my grandfather work because that was what he did. If he didn't have the tool to do what he needed, well, I'll just go make one over here. So, I mean, that's where his cutting pieces came from. So he was making those as he needed them. Oh, this one's dull. Okay, take 2 minutes, grind up another one, and carry on from there and get the work you needed. Yes.
Was he making his own metal type also? or-
Absolutely, he was. He
Is it a
overall
wax thing
he
you get to
he
make it?
cut and cast 9 metal fonts in his career. I think at least 7 of which were of his own design. One of them was a metal casting of the font design. I've got it written down here somewhere.
Hannibal and Stern.
No, it wasn't Hannibal. Those ones were of his own design. Cartier Roman was actually based directly off the work of another font designer who was basically one of the first font designers in Canada to really start doing it. And that's what sparked my grandpa's idea of, oh, well, if another Canadian can do it, why can't I? And then he started taking off from there.
What are they carved out of? Material?
His final font, Hannibal Old Style and Stern were carved out of brass originally.
Well, they carve them right in the actual brass?
Yep,
Oh,
right
so
into
you
brass
don't
sheets.
have
He did it in 2 stretches. First off, he would hand draw it. He would then take that drawing into this program he had called Icarus, where he would click all the little points across it, and that would map it out. He would then print that, cut it into basically a little cardboard die, and then take that to a pantograph downstairs. Step 1 would shrink it to about half size on little blocks he made out of just straight printer's lead, because it was fast and easy and it was infinitely reusable for him. And then those dies he would then cut directly straight down into brass. And there is actually photos of some of the ones up there of the brass ones that he cut. But it was done in 2 stages. It was cut and then put through his monotype caster to produce the font itself.
Just to amplify on the question you had about the casting of the type, he actually had three casters, and you would put a mat in there and it would inject the hot type, the hot metal, and it would actually form the piece of type, one after another after another. And I don't know if you saw a picture of a light shade and a bulb, and it was all molten lead. Yeah, he had a couple of mishaps.
He had a few
He
machines
was
down
pinned
there.
against the wall one day with a piece of plywood and hot metal shooting at it.
Yeah, he had 3 main machines. There was a monotype supercaster, there was a linotype caster, and he also had a Thompson cast, which is a very upright machine. And the photo these referring to was directly above the Thompson, because that thing could spit like there's no tomorrow. And yeah, that was one of the other great stories was he comes down, and it's a narrow hallway, maybe this wide, to try to get towards that machine. That's shooting hot lead 8 feet straight at him. So he had to pick up a piece of plywood and hold it like a shield as he ran at the machine to try to turn it off. But
On his casting, I believe that Stern actually came out simultaneously in lead as well as digital.
yes, it actually...
Which was quite unique.
Yeah,
to have
it did set history with that one. The first one
Yes.
ever done in digital and hot lead, which was really easy for him to do because through the 80s and 90s working with Icarus, he found, oh, well, I can use digital and still create a font, but then use that and make it even easier for me to make my hot lead fonts. So he would release them in all. I don't believe his final one of Hannibal Old Style was ever released in digital. Most of his fonts were. I think there's only 2 of them he never released in digital format.
But didn't he cast Stern after Hannibal?
Actually, he may have, yeah.
Was his last one?
It was his last one.
Yeah. 30 sets or 100 sets, I think, 100 spots.
I have a
Were you on that list? Did you buy a font?
actually, Jim donated it to me. Price was right, but no, I bought other.
Because that was released very, very exclusive online. You had to pre-book ahead. I missed out on that. Yeah, there was only 100 fonts set cast.
No, I visited it only once, and I remember that bloody thing of bubbling hot lead
Yeah.
You know, he just told us to be careful.
Did he do the finger in the lead trick?
Yeah.
Oh, no, he didn't do that. No.
To impress the girls.
What did he
That-
do?
A few years ago, a TV show Mythbusters did the myth about printers being able to stick their finger in the hot lead. And when I saw that, I laughed, because that was no myth to us. That was one of Dad's favorite tricks. As he always said, this is what printers do to impress the girls. And he would dry the finger off just right, and he would dip his finger into the lead. A clip of that is on the one documentary that
Wow.
Yeah, that was
shot, one of the
I
extras.
used to take students from SFU to see Jim. Prior to that, my students from Quantlin.
Yes.
So I was in that shop many times when he was casting type, and I have a short video that I can send you. I said, look, Roberto, this is what I do to impress girls. And he did the thing. So as I was there, he did it absolutely.
Yeah, no, I was.
He heard you didn't say.
We'd like to have that if you could send us that.
He hit it well.
Amazing.
No, it was the one amazing thing to see was his equipment with the pots of the molten lead sitting there. And the days out back when he'd be melting down the long ingots to actually put in, and he'd have the big kiln outside melting down the metal and pouring it into the molds and stacking up the bars out.
Totally illegal.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
The
not a
more,
fire
the,
hazard
the,
at
the
all.
more illegal, the better.
We used to
One
have
of-
a lie bath in the backyard, maybe a kid's swimming pool. We would buy a kiddie pool, and when we were restoring a press, we'd take the press apart and fill the kiddie's pool with lye crystals and water, and just lay the parts in, put a piece of plywood over it, and leave it for 2 days, and come back and paint with oil.
I hope
grease
no
everything,
kid crawled
strip it off.
underneath the plywood.
There were a few neighborhood kids he wanted to invite for a swim.
We grew up in this house.
Yeah.
I was always annoyed they never let me go for a swim. What can you
So
do?
yeah, I mean, we grew up helping them restore these things. It's just,
Yes, one of the things I've heard many times from many people is how generous Jim was
Oh my
with
God.
young craftspeople, and he would give his time and teach people things.
Richard, I attest to that. I took probably 10, 12 classes at
Easily.
least of 18 to 19, 20 students, and he didn't spare a minute. I mean, he didn't just he gave it all.
Well, during
It's
his
absolutely
teaching,
passionate and generous man.
during his teaching, when he was doing the classes, he would of course, bring the whole class over to the house and show them off the shops. But even after he retired from teaching, because he just didn't feel like doing the drive every day, his old peers would say, "Hey, I've got a class. I want to see your shop. Can you bring it by?" And the door was always wide open. That was the thing with him, was his absolute just open generosity.
Yeah.
If you walked up, if you just heard his name and went down to the shed and knocked on with a smile, he'd open it up and hand you a cup of coffee and bring you right in.
Yeah.
So he was always, he wanted to share the art and the craft with as many people as he could. So absolutely, those doors were always wide open to anyone breathing who decided to walk in. They were always welcomed and greeted as a friend. So.
When I was a student at college, I went to go visit Jim because he did a demo in class. He was doing an illustration of an airplane. And he said, if people want to come on by, just come on down. And I went down and I spent an afternoon with him. And I initially just meant to just drop by for half an hour. I spent the afternoon and I came away with an old Safeway bag of old tins of paint, or of ink, just so I could practice at home.
Yeah, that sounds
And
right.
he told me where to get materials from Chinatown, to get a woodcut set that cost me like $8, because he said, you're a student, you shouldn't spend that much money. And also his trick of warming up the lino cut, that he would actually put it on the heat vent. So little things like that, never forgotten it. Your grandfather's left a legacy.
No, absolutely. It's that's one of the magic things. Is it wasn't just his own work and him trying to be like, hey, look how awesome I am. For him, it was just about, I want to produce art and I want to help everyone else produce as much art as I can. Which is why he did so much teaching during his freelance days. He realized it was really the twilight era of printing, and he was doing everything to keep it alive because he loved it so much, and he wanted to spread that love to other people as much as he could.
I remember a stone sculpture behind the house too. Didn't he?
Oh,
carve in stone?
the font that was carved into
Doing
it?
same titling. That
No,
was the font
I
they
mean,
liked so much.
he just didn't he? Did he?
Oh, he had
Yeah.
some wooden sculptures, but he carved some typefaces into.
He carved the stone right into the shop. It was soapstone, I think, or
Yeah,
marble.
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 I have that.
Ah, okay.
It was,
There's actually a
yeah,
photo of
it
it
was
there.
his friend's design there, Dunsing's
Yep.
titling font, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, which is also actually,
This one here, I have a copy of that.
Dad would do anything like that, carve into stone,
Just gonna
build a
keep moving,
boat,
it's gonna be hilarious.
work on these machines. Anything that he wanted to do, he just did. You could do anything just by finding the books. If he didn't know how to do something, he'd find a book, he'd learn how to do it, he'd do it. If he didn't have the tools, he built the tools. Anything was possible for him. That's the kind of guy he was.
Yeah.
any last questions before I let you guys run away and then we all go off and get as much ice cream as we can?
Well, Alex, on behalf of the Society, I'd like to thank you. You've reminded me that I was one of the lucky ones that got a whole afternoon of his attention down there in that crazy subterranean workshop. And I always felt that I'm the last people to see lead being poured, you know. Wonderful experience.
Yeah, it was-
Some of us have had, you know.
It was always amazing. I didn't realize until far too late in life the true magic that was happening down there.
Absolutely,
I
unique.
mean, as a little kid, I could always imagine it was this domain of the mad scientist, and later in life I realized, wow, it actually is. So it was pretty amazing. But yeah, the work down there was, it was good, it was fun, but man, it was heavy hauling those things of lead into the shop for him. So he made you put your back into it.
So, on behalf of us all, Alex, thank you very much.
So thank you very much.